Good morning, everyone. 5 minutes ago, when it was 9:30, artificial intelligence initiated the speakers who said that we should sit around the table and start with our session. 5 minutes later, instead of 15 minutes later as academic liberty, we'll do 5 minutes later to start this panel. So I want to greet all of you and thank you for being here. I see all panelists are on board. Rovshan is also on board and overseeing everything. It looks, his face shows that we have reason to be feeling good about how we started yesterday and hope that we will continue in this same manner. The panel name is Pathway to Peace, and we have 8 distinguished panelists. My suggestion as a moderator would be just to say that, of course, you will say whatever you decided to say anyway before you came here, but I would appreciate very much if you either take general principles under the title Pathways to Peace. What are the major strategic points that we should have in mind? I would also suggest that we make distinction between getting to peace and getting to sustainable peace. Today we are in a time of crisis management where we are talking about stopping non-peace, stopping violence, which is far, even when we stop it, far away from the peace, and especially far away from sustainable peace. So it would be good that we have distinction between these 3, let's say, pathways. Pathways to stop the confrontations, pathways to peace, and pathways to sustainable peace. Of course, at the same time, I'm sure that we cannot talk about pathways to the sustainable or pathways to peace in today's world without trying to have example, which is proving what are we saying and what are we talking about. 2 examples are self-evident. Ukraine, aggression in Ukraine, in, I won't say Gaza, I won't say Palestine, I will say peace in the Middle East, broader context of the peace. So with that having in mind as a setting the framework which you are already familiar with, I would call President Viktor Yushchenko, dear friend, to take the floor.
Дорогі і шановні всі присутні,
My dear and respected colleagues,
я хотів перш за все подякувати за всі ті гарні, теплі слова, які вчора висловили ви в адрес моєї країни.
first I'd like to thank you all for the warm words I heard from so many of you yesterday about my country.
Я дуже вдячний за те, що ви розумієте російську війну не тільки як проблему України,
I'm so glad that you understand that the Russian war is not just Ukraine's problem.
насправді це проблема нас всіх.
Indeed, it's a problem for all of us.
Це війна проти вас,
It's a war against you,
проти вашої людини, проти кожної країни світу.
against every individual and every country of the world.
І тому вона така актуальна.
And that's why it's so relevant today.
Немає зібрання у світі, де б ми не зустрічалися, щоб на ньому не стояло питання російської війни.
And now, wherever you go in the world for any kind of meetings, there is the topic of the war, the Russian war in Ukraine.
Багато попередніх наших конференцій ми присвячували питанню безпеки.
You know, we spoke at previous conferences very often about the topic of security.
І прийшли до абсолютно розумного і очевидного висновку, що на політичному порядку дня перше питання, яке повинно стояти, це питання безпеки.
And we came to the conclusion that when we talk about important issues, the first and foremost issue should be security.
Ми тоді говорили про те, що на сході Європи 6 воєн.
I've often told you that there are 6 wars in Eastern Europe.
Воює Грузія,
You know, Georgia's fighting,
воює Молдова,
Moldova,
воює Азербайджан,
Azerbaijan,
потім Україна.
Ukraine,
І агресор кругом один
with one single aggressor being Russia.
– це Росія. І тому сьогоднішній день нас змушує дуже детально придивитися, як так трапилося, що на фоні останніх 20-30 років у світі появився агресор, який сотворив конфлікт найбільший після Другої світової війни.
And so we have to ask ourselves, what has happened that we have an aggressor that over the last 20 years has been created that has brought the largest war since World War II?
Як родився путінізм?
How was Putinism born?
Як трапилось так, що останні 12 років він щодня отримав від самого стабільного, від самого платіжного ринку світу, Західної Європи, $1 мільярд.
How was it that for 12 years Putin was able to get from Europe, from the civilized world, $1 billion every single day?
Як трапилось, коли Грузія і Україна направили відповідні клопотання до секретаріату НАТО щодо приєднання відносно плану дій членства, нам відмовили.
And how was it that when Ukraine and Georgia asked for membership in NATO, they were denied?
І Путін через 1,5 місяці нападає на Грузію.
And a few months after that, Putin attacked Georgia.
А Росія підписує після вступу російської армії у Грузії, Європа підписує із Росією, мається на увазі Франція і Британія, разом із Газпромом, підписують злополучну угоду «Сєвєрний поток-1».
And just a couple of months after attacking Georgia, Putin's able to sign an agreement with France and Germany to create Nord Stream 1.
Це в той час, коли в Росії вже було 12 тисяч танків, а, наприклад, у самій потужній армії Європи в Бундесвері було 400.
And this was at a time when you had in the largest, Russia had 12,000 tanks, and the largest army in Europe, that of Germany, had 400.
Проходить 6 років, Путін нападає на Україну.
6 years later, Putin attacks Ukraine.
Підло, як завжди, без проголошення війни,
He did it deviously, as always, without declaring war.
без відповідних амулетів. Його армія заходить у Крим, а потім у Луганськ і Донецьк.
He entered first Crimea, then Luhansk and Donetsk.
Ми майже не чули заяв західного світу.
We heard almost nothing from the Western world.
Після Грузії Путін дивився на це як на шосейну дорогу, яка запрошує до нової мілітаризації.
Because after Georgia, he realized that this was an open road for him, that he would be allowed to do what he wanted to do.
Ви можете мислити, що в 2014 році підписується після його окупації Криму і Донбасу другий етап газової угоди «Сєвєрний поток-2».
And so what happens after he invades Ukraine in 2014? They signed Nord Stream 2.
Що з нами робиться?
What is happening?
Невже ми втратили останні кусочки совісті політичної?
Have we lost all our sense of conscience?
І знову, я думаю, що ви пригадуєте, яка реакція була тоді демократичного світу.
I think you remember the reaction of the democratic world.
Пам'ятайте, будь ласка, лист Путіна середини грудня 21-го року.
And remember Putin's letter of December 21,
В якому він ясно сформулював свою доктрину.
where he announced his doctrine very clearly
3 умови
with 3 conditions.
до західних союзників. Це лист до президента Сполучених Штатів і генсека НАТО.
It was a letter to the President of the U.S. and to the General Secretary of NATO.
Перш за все, дорогі адресати, поверніть НАТО до кордонів 1997 року.
He said, please return NATO to the borders of 1997.
Друге питання. Поверніть звичайні війська в дислокації, які вони займали у 1997 році в Європі.
Bring all the soldiers you had back to their positions of 97.
І третя умова. До вільного світу. Не дай Бог, ви поставите на порядок дня розширення НАТО.
and don't even consider expanding NATO.
Через 25 днів почалася війна
And
Росії проти України.
25 days, or a number of days later, he invaded Ukraine.
Послухайте його останнє інтерв'ю, і він ніколи не буде говорити, що він воює з українським народом.
You know, if you listen to his interviews, including his latest ones, he never talks about fighting against the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian nation,
Він завжди воює з агресивним НАТО.
because he's always claiming to be fighting against an aggressive NATO.
Він завжди воює з західним світом.
He's fighting the Western world.
А українці – це ж рідні брати. Як з ними воювати?
He can't be fighting Ukrainians because they're his dear brothers.
Оце такий політичний блуд. За останні 15, можливо, 20 років ми бачили на своїх очах, який привів, власне кажучи, до, по суті, Третьої світової війни.
And this is the political nonsense that has led us to a position where we are now on the brink of a third world war.
Ця війна ведеться проти країни, яка 80 років назад була одним із засновників Організації Об'єднаних
You know,
Націй.
this is a war against a country that was a founding member of the United Nations.
Ця війна ведеться проти країни, яка через 50 років після вступу, після творення Організації Об'єднаних Націй, прийняла перше в світі ядерне роззброєння.
This is a country that 50 years later was the first country to denuclearize itself.
Ми передали Росії 1700 ядерних зарядів.
We gave Russia 1,700 warheads, nuclear warheads.
Більшість носіїв ядерної зброї.
Most of the nuclear carriers.
І взамін ми отримали, як ми вважали, самий унікальний безпековий документ, який міг появитися в тому часі.
And we thought in return we had gotten a very unique security guarantee.
Це гарантії ядерного клубу
A guarantee from the nuclear club of the world,
Сполучених Штатів,
which include the
Росії,
US, Russia,
Британії.
and Great Britain.
Пізніше до цих положень приєдналися, як ви пам'ятаєте, Китай.
And later this was joined by China and by France.
Із усіх 6 країн, які підписали цей пакет виконала до сьогоднішнього дня тільки одна країна.
6 countries joined this memorandum, this packet of agreements. Only one country fulfilled its side of the bargain,
Це моя Україна.
and that's my country.
Жоден із підписантів самих великих престижного ядерного клубу належні зобов'язання свої не виконав.
Not one of the others carried out their part of the bargain.
А в чому цих суть зобов'язань?
And what were their obligations in it?
Фундаментальне і базове.
It was fundamental.
Кожна із ядерних країн нам підписала про те, що вони гарантують. Слово «гарантують» я підкреслюю. Гарантують територіальну цілісність і повний суверенітет над національними територіями
What they
України.
signed was that they guaranteed our territorial integrity and our full sovereignty.
Знаєте, тут цілі докторські дисертації можна писати, на якому етапі хто як себе повів за ці останні 30 років.
You could write entire doctoral dissertations about what each of the parties of this agreement, how they acted during those
Я
years.
підкреслюю, моя Україна виконала все.
I want to repeat that my country fulfilled its agreement, part of the agreement.
Але на сьогодні ми втратили поки що 18% території,
But we have now lost 18% of our territory.
8 мільйонів українців виїхали за межі
We
України.
have 8 million people who are refugees abroad.
Ми втратили 50% енергетики України.
They have destroyed 50% of our energy capability.
Зруйнована найбільша в Європі гідростанція на Дніпрі.
They destroyed the largest hydroelectric dam, hydro station in Europe.
Окупована найбільша в Європі ядерна станція з 6
They have
реакторами.
occupied the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe with 6 reactors.
Із 6 нафтопереробних заводів у нас не працює жоден завод.
And out of the 6 oil refineries, not one is working.
І якщо ви хочете доїхати з Києва до Варшави, візьміть, будь ласка, 3-літрову банку дизельного палива чи бензину, бо тільки із Польщі і других країн Західної Європи ми його отримаємо.
And we can only get our gasoline for our cars from Poland or other places in Western Europe.
Ми мали другу металургію Європи, яка сьогодні майже не працює.
We had the second largest metallurgy production in Europe, which doesn't work today.
Ви знаєте, ми маємо перше в Європі продовольче виробництво.
You know, we had the most production of agriculture in all of Europe.
Всі хімічні заводи, які забезпечували роботу сільського господарства і переробки його продуктів, сьогодні не працюють.
All the chemical factories that worked to create the fertilizer and everything we needed for agricultural production to ship food throughout the world has not been working.
Ми втратили тисячі людей.
And we have lost thousands and thousands of people's lives.
Наших дітей викрали.
They steal our children.
Тільки дітей, імена яких установлені міжнародною організацією, сягають майже 20 тисяч.
We have the names of 20,000 children, but there are many more.
І Андрій Миронов, лідер одної з пропутінських партій, вихваляється, як він виховує українську
And Andriy
дитину.
Mironov, one of the leaders of Putin's party, has bragged about how he has adopted one of these
А
children.
омбудсмен російського президента по політиці дітей б'є рекорди, вона виховує 2 дитинки з
And the
України.
ombudsman for children under Putin has broken his record by adopting 2 of our children.
Знаєте, я цей рівень підняв тільки для того, щоб от з висоти цього, можливо, у нас, я маю на увазі в міжнародній спільноті, появиться та сміливість, рішучість і ті обов'язки перед світовим правом, які ми на кінець повинні включити для того, щоб це позорище, цей фашизм зняти з порядку денного.
You know, I raise all of these issues because I'm trying to somehow inspire in the international community courage, determination, activism to somehow react to this fascism that Russia is showing in our country.
Наші колеги сьогодні поставили питання, давайте ми акцент зробимо на дефініції миру.
Today, our colleague Zlatko said, let's try to put a definition to peace.
Це, можливо, сама найбільш часто вживана категорія політична сьогодні,
You know, we hear a lot of the word peace today.
яка сама по собі є надзвичайно складною.
It's a very difficult concept.
Бо якщо я запитаю навіть у цій аудиторії, шановні мої друзі, а що ви включаєте в дефініцію перемоги?
Because if I asked you, my good friends and colleagues, what you consider victory,
Як ви її бачите?
how do you see it?
Україна повинна капітуляцію підписати.
Do you see it as Ukraine capitulating?
Чи Україна повинна призвати розділ території по лінії фронту?
Or give up the lands beyond the front lines?
Чи ми повинні вийти на кордон 91-го року?
Or should we be getting our land back to what we had in 91?
Чи, можливо, ми задумаємося, що навіть повний пакет виконання цих кроків нам спокою не принесе?
Or can we say that even if we got that, we could not really feel that we will be secure and in peace?
Я пояснюю свою точку зору.
My point of view is
Мир – це завжди наслідкова категорія.
peace is what is a consequence.
Будьте уважні, коли ви його вживаєте, цю категорію.
Make sure you understand what you're saying when you use the word peace.
Мир і досить довгий буває після капітуляції.
Because you could have peace for a long time after capitulation, after surrender.
Ми говоримо про цей мир.
Is that the kind of peace we want?
Це, здається, політикам саме простіше.
For politicians, that's the easiest thing.
Згадайте 1938 рік,
Remember 1938,
як був підписаний знаменитий позорний у дипломатичній хрестоматії мирний Мюнхенський договір.
when the odious Munich agreement was signed.
Але він виписаний був благими мірами і побажаннями.
But it was done with great hopes and wishes.
Давайте ми заспокоїмо Гітлера.
Let's make Hitler happy. Let's calm him down.
Та давайте ми віддамо шматок землі держави, яку ми навіть, як Чемберлен казав, і на карті не можемо
Let's
знайти.
give him a piece of land in a country that Chamberlain said we can't even find on a map.
І в лондонському аеропорту йому аплодувала ціла зграя журналістів.
And all the journalists applauded him when he returned to the London
Бо
airport
прем'єр привіз мир,
because he brought peace.
на який через декілька днів великий друг демократії Черчилль сказав:
And how did Churchill respond to this a few days later?
вибачте, не мир привіз.
I'm sorry, you did not bring us peace.
Ти привіз війну
You brought us war
і ганьбу.
and shame.
І через 9 місяців починається сама складна, кровожадна в історії людства Друга світова війна.
And 9 months later, the worst war in history in terms of victims began.
Нас останні 2-3 роки надзвичайно політично тиснуть, щоб Україна прийняла умови розподілу прийняття мирного плану по лінії фронту.
And now for 2 years, everybody has been, 2 years, everybody has been pushing Ukraine to accept a ceasefire on the borders of the current conflict.
Не буду я коментувати, бо Златко мені вже на носок наступає.
I know I have to finish.
Я лише хочу сказати, що
What I want to say at the end is
українське бачення миру
the way we see peace
– це вигнати ворога до загальнопризнаних всім світом національних кордонів України 91-го року.
to the internationally recognized borders of 1991.
І других компромісів не буде.
That's that we have to get rid of Putin till there, and no other compromises are possible.
Але якщо хтось подумає, що це достатньо, щоб умити руки і сказати, ми, як політики, діючі чи в тому стані, що ми знаходимося,
Everyone thinks that they can now wash their hands of it, and that's all that needs to be done.
це нечесна і неповна відповідь.
That's not the end.
Це ситуація, коли ми проблему передаємо своїм дітям чи своїм онукам.
This is a problem that we're then going to be handing down to our children or our grandchildren.
Доки залишається фашистський путінський режим,
As long as there is the fascist Putin regime
оця банда, яка 25 років при владі,
and this gang that's been in power for 25 years,
яка знищила в Росії політичну опозицію,
which ruined every opposition party in Russia
яка знищила свободу слова,
and freedom of speech,
яка сформувала політичний режим, при якому не працює жодна державна інституція, включаючи
and
парламент.
which doesn't allow any national institution, including parliament, to operate.
Я вас благаю,
So I just want to
не
ask you,
будуйте плани жити з тим режимом
don't make plans to live with that regime
у вашому майбутньому.
in your future.
Це помилкова думка.
That is a mistake.
Політичний режим Путіна повинен бути знищений.
Putin's political regime has to be destroyed.
Яка трансформація на заміну прийде, ми зараз не обговорюємо.
It's not up to us to decide what comes afterward.
Але це мінімум, ми що можемо зробити і мусимо зробити для того, щоб звучало слово перемога.
But that's the minimum for us to call it victory.
Дякую. Я вибачаю, що я зірвав
I'm sorry if I went over the protocol time.
регламент.
Yes, Victor, you went over protocol time a few times, but you're excused because you're the only one out of 9 of us who's coming from the part of the world, either Gaza or Ukraine, literally. So that's the reason why, of course, artificial intelligence will stop you a long time ago, but I'm just expert in artificial intelligence. I'm not artificial intelligence myself. So thank you very much. I mean, your overview of the situation in Ukraine was more than appreciated, and I'm sure every time when you take the floor, you push us to make a step forward instead to stop or either, especially not to go backwards. So thank you so much. Alfred Gusenbauer, you are the next one on this panel, and you will be stopped by artificial intelligence.
Friends, colleagues, it's not easy to follow up on Victor's impressive presentation of the war that is going on by Russia against Ukraine, and he enlightened us on some of the major dimensions of the conflict, the destruction, and what could be perspectives for the future. My basic question in this context, and not only in this one, is do we learn from history, and what do we learn from history? And my major reading is that wars are going to happen if one of the actors in a specific area has the impression that by using violence he can gain advantages that without violence he would not gain. And contradicting that, times of peace are happening when all the actors in a specific geopolitical area have the impression that there is a structural interest for themselves to have peace in the area. This is, by the way, what Immanuel Kant also meant when he was describing the concept of the eternal peace, is that the task is to create constellations where no actor sustainably is going for violence but has a sustainable interest in peace, because he is convinced that an aggression and using violence is only producing costs and not benefits. In fulfilling this concept, there have been different attempts over history, and I think we all recall the major conclusions that led to a new order of the world. I mean, going back to the Augustinian peace, then later on, let's say the most sophisticated peace ever reached was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, because it was a multi-dimensional peace that embraced religious confrontations, constitutional confrontations, hegemonic confrontations, and the confrontations of states. And maybe never else in history such a challenging and sophisticated peace agreement was reached than the one of Westphalia. Needless to mention that before that peace could be reached, one third of the entire European population was eliminated by this 30 years war. 1/3 of the entire European population. And of course, this peace held up till the Vienna Congress, and this peace mainly managed till the end of the First World War. And the order that we are in right now is the one that was determined after 1945. So the question is the war of Russia against the Ukraine a war that tries to establish a new order in Europe and the world? And I think that this issue is not yet decided, because it very much depends on the outcome of the war. Or to put it the other way around, the larger the gain in territory by Russia is, the greater is the menace that a new order will be established, at least in Europe, if not in the world. So if one wants to maintain the peaceful order of the after 1945 period, one has to understand that everything has to be done in order to fight this Russian aggression in the Ukraine, because defeat in that endeavor would not only mean the fall of the Ukraine, but would also mean that maybe Mr. Putin has the power to establish a new order in Europe. And there are already a couple of analysts who are trying to paint the new picture of the world order, which is not characterized anymore by the bipolar situation that we had for many decades, and by the situation that the United States have been the only dominating force in the world. But they speak about a new dichotomy, which is mainly characterized by, let's say, a democratic, maybe also liberal West, composed of the United States of America and Europe, on the one hand, and on the other hand, an authoritarian East, mainly composed by Russia and China. And then, as an additional world power that is trying to find alliances, sometimes in the one, sometimes in the other direction, there will be countries like India who could be some sort of pivotal element in this new order of the power in the world. I do not know if this is going to happen, but I think we should do all and everything that it is not going to happen, because such an order would most probably create additional wars and additional conflicts, and such an order, in my understanding, does not guarantee the stability and the security that we are all aiming for. So the question is what to do. Yesterday, it was mentioned that even if we do not agree with China on a lot of issues, be it human rights and others, and we do not want to copy the Chinese model, we nevertheless have to engage in a conversation with China, not only because of its economic importance in the world, but also because we should avoid a situation where the coalition between China and Russia and maybe others is going to become too close and too sustainable. So we should try to avoid such a situation. The second thing, what we have to do is, as we cannot completely rely on the support of the United States of America for our European security interests, I think we have to negotiate a transition, which means a transition where Europe is going to build up its own military and defense capacities, which of course will take 10 to 12 years, not only from the financial perspective, but also technically and logistically. And for this transition time, we still need the American support, the American weaponry, and more specifically, the American control and command system, which is essential for the European security. But this has to happen on a negotiated path and not as an act of hostility against the US, but as a consequence of a new burden sharing between Europe and the United States of America. And thirdly, I think we should at least aim to reach a limitation of the belligerent activities of the war in the Ukraine nowadays. And I'm not talking about the ceasefire, but I think it would be already an element of civilization if one could agree not to bomb and send rockets against civilian targets in the area and avoid to destroy hospitals, schools, and houses of people. So to limit the war before it's decided to the military field and avoid the civilian targets. I'm not talking about victory because I think it's very difficult to define victory. For me, the most important thing is to free the Ukraine from the occupation. For me, it's important that the war and the killing stops. And for me, it's important that we are coming to a modernization of the present world order, which does not lead us into a new bipolar confrontation as the one that we had already before. And when my friend Stefan Löwen yesterday referred to the enormous danger of the nuclear weapons and the arsenals that are present all around the world, this should lead us also to the understanding that a total war has to be completely excluded, because as soon as one of the actors in place gets the impression that his only destiny is the use of nuclear weapons, then we are really at the end of our times. And therefore, I think that even if the situation at the moment is not very promising, that we have to introduce limitations to the belligerent activities. And my last sentence is
Thank you.
One of hope, which is sometimes in history it was not possible to reach everything at the same moment. So I think when you were referring to Germany and the Hitler times, who really thought in 1945 that only, let's say, decades later, we will have a united, peaceful Germany that is a fully accepted partner of the free world after this disaster that has been created by the Hitler regime and by the Second World War. It was not possible in 1945. but it was possible in 1989 and in the years after. And this historic legacy should initiate some hope into our debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alfred. Madam President, the floor is yours.
No, hello, am I on? Good morning, dear friends and colleagues. I think I'll start by trying to define very briefly what we mean by peace and what we mean by war, before we can able to start thinking about how to get from one to the other. Wars have taken different shapes over long periods of history, but basically the idea of a war is to impose, as Dr. Gusenbauer said, somebody's desire to impose their will on somebody else, and usually it is for the grabbing of resources or the collecting of tribute. Peace, at its simplest form, could be defined as the absence of armed conflict without any further qualifications, but it's the further qualifications that are really the most important and most difficult to achieve and to define. Let's start with the end of the Soviet Empire in 1991 and how Europe was redrawing its borders and its maps. The collapse of the Soviet Union, which I had predicted already 50 years earlier as a child from its own weaknesses, was inevitable, even if it did take half a century. But it was very difficult for the partners to accept. The bizarre thing that happened in history is that not only were Hitler and Stalin allies and friends for 2 years and exchanged both military equipment and plans for concentration camps and that sort of thing, but then Russia became, the Soviet Union to be precise, became a partner of the Western democracies. And America poured enormous resources. Whatever has been given to Ukraine at this point is just a fraction of what Russia received during the Second World War. And then during the Cold War, there was the Western powers were developing, and Western Europe was developing. The eastern part of Europe behind the Iron Curtain was stagnating. But for Western Europeans, it was very comfortable. And the propaganda that the Soviet Union put out was one to have these peace, doves of peace you see everywhere, and to convince the West they should not arm themselves, they should not be militarily prepared for any conflict. Peace was the thing that was desirable. And meanwhile, of course, they were accumulating so much armaments that to this day, they have enough of them from those days of peace promoting to shoot against Ukrainian civilians. What are the conditions of peace that are asked by Russia and that are supported, for instance, until yesterday or the day before, were supported by President Trump? The idea was that, first of all, we refuse, and it's a very curious thing, part of the West, including President Trump, refused to accept and to vote at the United Nations the simple constatation of fact that Russia invaded Ukraine, breaching international law and breaching international agreements. The fact that President Putin never calls it a war and would put in his own people in prison if they did use the word rather than a special military operation indicates to what extent the war that is going on currently, the conflict, happens, one, at the front, And there it's a matter of having who has more ammunition, who has more people, who has more resources, or who has more resourcefulness and creativity and the use of modern technologies and drone capabilities. Then there's the attacks on civilians, the death that rains from the skies as it did in the Second World War. And then finally there's the diplomatic and the propaganda war. And that is one which the current Federation of Russia has picked up and inherited from its predecessor, the Soviet Union. It's developed at a very high level of professional skill. And Western, I think, great many Western politicians and thought influencers and so on are actually seduced, as it were, by these arguments. So first, if you say there's a conflict, the formulation for the invasion of Crimea and of the Donbass was that there's some poor oppressed minority, the Russians of that part of Ukraine, who need to be saved from oppression and genocide by the Ukrainians, to the extent that the Ukrainians had wanted to develop their own national identity and national culture. And the concept of minorities and the rights of minorities being so important in the post-migration Western world, that it's politically correct to be nice towards your minorities. You should not be oppressing them. And having transformed a blatant invasion and aggression into a salvation exercise for poorly treated and sorely oppressed minority of Russians was, I think, by many in the West accepted as a fact rather than a fiction that it is. The attitude that we see taken by President Trump until, as I say, until a couple of days ago, had been that there's a war that Biden and Zelensky created, which is a total absurdity. It makes absolutely no sense. And that there's a war that he would have prevented had he been president and elected instead of Biden, because he has good personal relationships with Putin, and all it would have taken is a phone call to Putin, and everything would have been fine. But you see, President Macron, you may remember President Macron going to Paris and sitting at the end of this 6-meter-long table at one end, President Putin at the other end, and afterwards at the press conference when both came out to speak to the press, President Putin said, "You know, I am worn out. I sat there for 5 hours and more listening to this man trying to tell me things when I have told again and again, and my position is clear since it was presented at the Munich conference, you see, on security. And it has been presented by his foreign minister Lavrov and by his spokesman Karaganov. I sat with Karaganov on an OSCE committee led by Ambassador Ischinger for the OSCE. And already 10 years ago, the attitude of Russia was that they want to redraw the map of Europe. They want to redraw the security architecture of Europe. They want to have a sphere of influence and reconstruct, as it were, the grandeur and the greatness of the Soviet Union, which is their inherent right. And that means taking it away from anybody else who ever broke away from the Soviet Union after its collapse. So that what is happening in Ukraine is the result of an ideological reconstructionism of history, and it's equally delusional as some of the aspects of President Trump's argumentation that all it will take is one phone call on his part and that his power as a president and that his deal-making skills are so enormous that all it would take to stop wars all over the world, and he insists that he has already proved it 6 or 7 times, it depends, the number keeps changing, but that's a detail. So when we talk about in the West, and I see these influences also, University of Columbia, not far away from here, Jeffrey Sachs, who comes with argumentations defending the holy right of big countries to have spheres of influence, going back to the Monroe Doctrine of the Americans in the 19th century. There are influencers, if you like, in the West, whom I call actually nightingales of the Kremlin because they sing the same song. And they argue that, as it were, it's the victim who is at fault in the conflict in Ukraine. If they had simply done what the Russians asked of them, give up their language, give up their culture, I guess get rid of the government that they had elected in the last elections, and become a vassal state, a feudal sort of vassal state like Belarus, then things would be fine. So that if there's a conflict, it's the fault of the Ukrainians for resisting, because if they had simply accepted, as they frankly did in the case of Crimea, that, well, the deed is done, the Russians marched in, they took it, and they'll keep it. The fact that they resisted, I think, is seen as a scandal by many people, saying, well, you know, by resisting and not lying down and passively accepting occupation and capitulation and renouncing everything that they hold dear and important, that's their fault that the conflict is continuing. I think that the argumentation, the formulation of what is happening, why and how, the narrative, if you like, the narrative, the positioning, the conceptual positioning in this conflict as in others is just as important as what is happening at the front and what is happening in the skies. And therefore, it is very important to continue debates about the definitions of all these terms that are being bandied about and thrown about as solutions to a grievous situation in which blood continues to flow and lives continue to be lost and infrastructure is getting destroyed and nature gets to be destroyed. But the formulation of what it is that we are defending, why we're defending it, and who has the moral authority, if you like, on their side, all these debates are extremely crucial because they influence how the world is going to react to what happens on the ground.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to, Elaha, I see you over there. I just want to warn the Secretariat that our session will be probably a little bit longer than given in the schedule, because not of the fact that we have 21 minutes to go. The speakers from this side are already speakers who see the 21 minutes clock, but we will go more than 21 minutes because the next session is going to be given also 1 hour and 15 minutes like was given to us. Since we are 8 speakers and there are 6 speakers, I'm sure that they will not mind if we take some of their time, but we will hope, and I do hope that we will not take all of their time. If we keep going with this speed, we will then be in a battle against lunch. So having said so, Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zlatko, and I will try to be as brief as possible because I think it was important for us to hear from Vaira and from Victor about their experiences with war. But you know, peace is a universal aspiration, and achieving it remains one of our most complex challenges, especially when we have aggressors in the world who try to, as Vaira pointed out, take peace away and cause war by being aggressive. true peace involves not just the absence of war, but, things that will help prevent war. The presence of justice, equality, and understanding among peoples. And as we know, and we've discussed today, there are many ongoing conflicts around the world that have resulted in significant human suffering, geopolitical instability, and widespread humanitarian crisis. But I think the ones that, we focus most on are the war in Ukraine, and thank you, Victor, for sharing your remarks with us, and the war in Gaza. And I want to thank, I think Scipia has stepped out, she's not on our panel, but I want to thank her for her work, her tireless work in trying to resolve the conflicts there. And as Victor pointed out, there are many other wars, frozen conflicts in former Soviet space, and stopping these wars and conflicts requires a multifaceted approach. And looking at the root causes, why are there aggressors that cause the wars? And as Zlatko said, we don't just want to prevent conflict, but how do we resolve it? And then how do we make it sustainable? How do we have a sustainable peace like we've had in Northern Ireland or like we had in Bosnia? These aren't perfect, but at least they have been sustainable over the years. And again, as Victor told us, Ukraine does affect the people of Ukraine, but it affects all of us in direct and indirect ways. Now, as a former diplomat, I would always support diplomacy as a cornerstone of peaceful negotiations rather than military conflict. And having dialogue and negotiation hopefully prevents violence. We know that's not always true. But there are international organizations like the UN should play a role in mediating conflicts, supporting peace talks, and also organizations like NGIC and the organization I work for. We encourage open communication, tolerance, understanding, to help bring people together to prevent misunderstandings that lead to conflict. So how can we get diplomatic solutions? If there's already a military conflict, and we know there is in Ukraine, how can we have a ceasefire? How can we, get people to come to the table and find agreements that are sustainable? I believe we need international mediators, such as the UN, European Union, and other regional actors that can facilitate agreements. There need to be peace talks. Long-term peace requires sustained dialogue, not just for a short period of time, but over many years. And I think, as I mentioned, I have lived and been involved in the resolution of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And how was that? How did that come about? It's because the leaders of the US, Ireland, and the UK worked tirelessly with the parties to the conflict. We have in this room with us members of the countries of former Yugoslavia. The Dayton Peace Accords, again, were facilitated by the United States. But all of you showed courage and leadership, like Boris, Mladen, Zlatko, Ivo, Bordet, Vuk, Milica, and more. So I commend you for keeping and trying to keep peace in your region. But in Ukraine, I would say, while I initially would commend President Trump for trying to look for peace talks, the talks must involve Ukraine. They must involve other international partners, not just the U.S., but European Union and European nations to make sure that we have security. Because without security, as you mentioned, there can be no peace, in my mind. And the same thing, in Israel and Gaza. The talks must include Israel, Palestinian representatives, and I think not only regional stakeholders, but, for me, this is one thing that I think, and I call on the president of my country, Trump, to work on trying to bring, peace to these, especially these two conflicts. It just cannot be peace without international partners who are dedicated to helping find resolution to the conflict. We can, try things like sanctions, diplomatic isolation, encourage the parties to come to the table, but as we can see, these are not always effective. So what's the conclusion for me? Because I'll be brief. Pathways to peace have to be multifaceted. they require cooperation at all levels, not only from individuals, governments, but also international organizations. We needed a coordinated effort, and as Victor said, we need courage. We need our leaders to be courageous and to show leadership. I think that's what helped resolve conflicts in the past, and that's the only way we can, bring conflicts to an end in the future. So while the path to peace is challenging, I know we've got strong leaders who are courageous right here in the room with us, but I hope that we can influence, and through NGIC and other informal diplomatic dialogues, that we can offer a hope for peace throughout the world. And I will say, Victor, I think you really brought up important things that we need to think about. What is the resolution? Do you give up your territory? How will you rebuild? These are all very important issues that are easy for me to talk about, but you are the people who have to decide what you can live with and how you can maintain peace. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Zippy and everyone else in the room who have brought peace in the world. That's all I'll say. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Amir, the legend goes on. Put that close to your...
Thank you.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you, Zlatko. The pathway to peace is a highly complicated issue. It has a definition. It used to have a definition that through negotiations, good offices, mediation, pathways to peace are being created. Now, after the changes that happened and still happening in the international situation, international politics, a different definition should be considered. For example, when South Africa took Israel to the court, to the International Court of Justice, in order for the ICJ to uphold international law and bring back international humanitarian law to function. That was a pathway to peace. Reintroducing international law is a pathway to peace. When, a few days ago, the issue of two-state solution was decided by overwhelming majority, and among them, among those countries that have recognized the right of the Palestinian people to a state, to a viable state, that was the path to peace, is the pathway to peace. And here I wish to refer to how history is evolving. Britain, who started it all back in the final years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, especially by this so-called Balfour Declaration, by its recognition of the right of the Palestinians to a state of their own, a viable state. We have Starmer's declaration as opposed to Balfour Declaration, and it would help not only restore justice, but also to save the reputation of the so-called Western values. Also, the French Declaration of Recognition of a Palestinian state is important to reintroduce a different policy by the West, in particular by Europe. And this was also a pathway to peace. Yesterday, Gordon Brown said, and I quote, "We used to live in a world governed by law. Now we live in a world controlled by power, controlled by force. And if it is controlled by force, it will be resisted by force." Pathways to peace will have to give opportunity, to give hope to the people who are under occupation or their rights are being violated. I believe, gentlemen, that as one of our colleagues here told me yesterday, if I don't have anything to live for, I must have something to die for. Hence came resistance, hence came martyrdom, hence the conflict continues. I believe that the recognition of a Palestinian state, especially by Europe, Canada, Australia, and those good developed countries, that would open a new era in the conflict in our region, that is West Asia, North Africa, and Eastern Mediterranean. If it is to be implemented, and I believe it will be, because now everybody is very much aware, that have awakened to the gimmicks that we have seen for the last 20 to 30 years through negotiations just to waste time and give enough time for more acquisition of territories. I believe that we have a new opening, or at least I hope so. At the same time, I think that saving the so-called Western values is coupled by dealing with the so-called conflict of civilizations. This recognition of the Palestinian rights will help reconsideration of what do we mean? What did he, Mr. Huntington, mean by clash of civilizations with a special reference to Islam? This also will benefit if the Palestinian question is put on the right track towards solution. There are a lot of benefits for all of us to solve the Palestinian question through establishing their own state, which should be a viable state, because with viability comes responsibility. If it is not viable, it could not be responsible for maintaining peace and security. Viable state, that it should be. I believe that now that we have seen the trend among nations to decide collectively that we recognize the Palestinian right to to a state. And recognition of that state, I believe that our council here, the Nizami Janjaweed International Council, or International Center, should support this drive and declare that this center supports the two-state solution policy. And this will not be the first time this council discusses political issues. Statements, communiques have been issued concerning the issue of Russia and Ukraine, and other issues of political dimensions. So it is so proper, so necessary, and so basic for the credibility of this council to declare that we support the two-state solution in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I say so by way of a proposition, a proposal, not only suggestions, but a proposal that this should be accepted by us. And the position of the Council from now on is supporting the establishment of a Palestinian state, viable state, to live side by side with the Israeli state and the rest of the community, regional community, and the international community. This is something practical that I wish to put on record and insist on. We'll come back to discuss this issue whenever the need arises, and I believe it will arise very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amr. George just left for a second. He will be back. So, Peter, you're back? Oh, he's here. Okay. He just warned me that he's leaving out, but he didn't warn me that he's back. So George, since you're back, as Arnold Schwarzenegger says, you're back. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Zlatko. I've been in diplomacy for many years. I was 8 years foreign minister and also as prime minister. And of course, we are at a crossroads, and I feel it both childish, immature, and dangerous that we are in wars at a time when we need cooperation to deal with major existential issues such as climate change, pandemics, but also weapons of mass destruction. But I don't want, and I agree with much of which has been said up to now, I don't want to speak about the hard facts of diplomacy, which I've been working on many times. I was with Miguel Moratinos. We went to the Middle East many times when he was an envoy for the European Union, or on the issue of multilateralism and new forms of governance. I want to talk about something and also ask you for help on some of these ideas that I have. I want to talk about one area, which is how do we create narratives for peace for our citizens, for our societies. And I have felt that people's diplomacy has been very crucial. I know in our Greek-Turkish relations and with our Turkish friends here, it's been very important when we were able to work together at the citizens level to build a different narrative about our relations. When Greece got the recent Olympic Games in 2004, we made a proposal to bring back the idea of the Olympic truce. Now, the Olympics are maybe the biggest, most well-known event globally. The idea of the Olympic Games in ancient times were not just another game. it was actually a peace treaty. Officially a peace treaty. And it is the longest peace treaty of human history, 1,100 years. It's the most recognized today logo. And we wanted to revive this idea, moving the Olympics from the idea of more spectacle, advertising, big sponsors, and so on, revive the initial purpose. Let me give you a contrasting vision of why this paradigm can be useful for our global society. We have the Olympics on the one hand and the arena, the Roman arena, on the other one. I ask for forgiveness for my Italian friend here, but he's from Bologna, not from Rome, so that's a different thing. So the Olympics were founded as a peace treaty. Humanity was celebrated, as was excellence and respect, unity, fair play. Athletes competed as free citizens, bound by rules, the rule of law, honoring one another in peace. In contrast, the arena glorified violence. It turned human suffering into entertainment. It celebrated domination and submission. It was power without restraint, where the life or death of the powerless depended on the arbitrary decision of the emperor's thumb. A little bit like what we do today in social media. You know, we think we're little emperors. So the question is, do we turn our global stage into an arena of rivalry where raw power decides, where violence dominates, where humanity is diminished? Or do we choose a different Olympic spirit, if you like, of cooperation, peace, the rule of fair play, where we recognize our shared destiny and dignity of every human being, every human being? So this is not an abstract concept. So in ancient times, in the most difficult times, the Peloponnesian War, truce was respected. 27 years, it was respected, except for one time, Sparta disrespected it, violated the truce, and was banned and fined. Today, we were able, working in the IOC, in the Olympics in Pyeongchang in Korea. I went to Korea, China. We talked to the Chinese. They helped North and South Korea come in as a common team. Military exercises stopped. You may remember Trump then went to visit. Nothing came out of that, or at least nothing seemed to be coming out of it. But we had a moment of truce there. In the Nagano Olympics, we called, Clinton was about to bomb Iraq because of the Kurdish issue, if you remember. We called for a truce. Kofi Annan went to Iraq, stayed there for a week, or worked with them, and bombing was avoided. In Sarajevo, during the Lillehammer Games, one day, during the Balkan Wars, the Yugoslav internal fight, one day was declared a truce, and UNICEF went and vaccinated thousands of children. Now what we have is a UN resolution before every game. So now when Milano, Cortina are coming up, the UN will make a resolution on the Olympic truce. Los Angeles is later, in 2 years. Again, it will be a UN resolution, usually unanimous, not always. When we started this campaign, I asked for signatures. We had, with Ismail Cem, later on with Erdogan, we signed together. We had this signature of Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat, of the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, but also of Iran, of the US, Clinton signed, and China, Russia, then all European leaders, and I went to Nelson Mandela, he also signed. So we also have a lot of educational programs. So other than the high-level diplomacy, we have educational programs trying to build post-conflict peace. In Rwanda, for example, also working with other groups like the Seeds of Peace. Maybe Chippy Livni knows this one. It's a very important group. We hosted it in Olympia, Israelis and Palestinians sporting together. So I wanted to basically ask you, we are coming up to the Games in Milano, as I said, in Los Angeles, in the US, but it's also an ongoing process. I am now the president of the International Olympic Truce Center. I was recently appointed by the IOC only 2 months ago, and I'm looking for ideas and help and cooperation. How can we use these ideas? Can we use this with Ukraine? Can we use it with Gaza? People are saying we should ban Israel. I don't agree that we should ban Israel, but maybe we should say, CP, that there must be a truce if, I don't know what will be, maybe they'll have stopped by then, but in a few months we have Milano, must be a truce, and if you don't respect the truce, then you don't play. So there are things I would like to hear from you, and we have also the nuclear issue. Can we build on the idea of the Olympic truce also? This, again, is a soft power, but it's also very deeply connected with citizens' training, education around the idea of peace and fair play and rule of law at a global level. So thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zlatko. How to live in peace? This is the most important question of all times, but Europe already gave the answer of this question. After so many wars on its territory, Europe embraced the idea of the European Union, the basis of which is the integrity of existing borders and the refusal of territorial claims. But the greatest success, in my opinion, of post-war Europe is the building of a shared way of thinking for 3 generations of Europeans. And this way of thinking is the main key to peace on the European continent. I started with this banal introduction because the war that Russia started against Ukraine more than 3 years ago has completely shaken not only the European security architecture and principles, but also the very essence of the European way of thinking and living. Europeans ask themselves why Russia started this war at all. In the best case, Mr. Putin will get a little more of what he has the most, territory. In return, he has already lost too much. Russian economy is under enormous strain. The common border between NATO and Russia has increased dramatically after Finland joined the alliance. Hundreds of thousands of Russians are already killed. And finally, with this aggression, Mr. Putin has managed to create on his border a nation. This is Ukraine, which will hate Russia for the next 30 years at least. This is worse than having 5 American aircraft carriers in the Black Sea. In Alaska, President Trump proposed ceasefire and the start of negotiations, in exchange for which Moscow would return to the domain of international business. It was a generous offer that remained without any answer. This is not understandable from a Western point of view. Why, for Mr. Putin, war is more important than the promising economic prospects, and why Russian society doesn't say enough is enough? What is the core of Russia's motivation to continue the war? The motivation of Ukrainian people is understandably high. They are fighting for their freedom, moreover, for their survival. I think that the West cannot understand the Russian motivation because of using its own way of thinking. Contrary to Russian propaganda, the sanctions against Russia are working and are worsening the life of Russian people. However, without ignoring the brave anti-war voices of many Russian intellectuals, Russian citizens as a whole continue to endure these hardships and even support Kremlin policies. The most obvious explanation is, of course, propaganda. But the most important and deepest reason at the heart of Russian motivation is the way of thinking cultivated in Russian society for ages. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the European paradigm after the Second World War is that the focus of all policies should be the prosperity, rights, and freedom of citizens, and that the state should serve as an instrument for realizing these policies. The paradigm imposed on Russian society, even now, is exactly the opposite. Citizens are born to serve the interests of their state and, if necessary, to die for its territory. Russians are made believe that their happiness is built not on their standard of living and the number of rights and freedom, but on the fact that they are citizens of the largest country in the world, which is true, whose army terrifies everyone. According to the Russian paradigm, the citizens of Luxembourg must be quite unhappy because they live in a very tiny territory smaller than a Moscow district and with an army equal to one Russian regiment. Here, in my opinion, are the roots of the European lack of understanding of Russia. And the pathways to lasting peace on the European continent should involve a very clear understanding of the differences in the European and Russian way of thinking. The European paradigm definitely provides a better standard of living and more freedoms for its citizens, as well as guarantees against territorial conflicts within the European Union. The Russian paradigm, however, guarantees higher endurance and motivation during the war. War is not just the clash of men, steel, and more recently, drones, but also the ability of the population to endure the inevitable wartime hardships and deprivations, something Russians can do better. I have to admit, unfortunately, better than us. Conclusions. Europe will always be much more attractive in times of peace and much more vulnerable in times of war. Having in mind all this, plus the fact that Russia will always be our neighbor, should help us build a better strategy without any illusions and any prejudices to achieve lasting peace on the European continent and to help Ukrainians become part of the European project. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Robert?
Do you?
Thank you very much. I'd like to sort of shift gears maybe a little bit in this idea of getting to a sustainable peace by looking at the economic side. Because one of the reasons for conflict, I think as we've all recognized, as we've all talked in the last day, is poverty. And I would define poverty here not just in the UN sense of absolute poverty, but in poverty of people feeling they don't have enough, that they are disadvantaged in some way. And this reality both breeds conflict from within and can become a tool for those who want to cause conflict, that they can use this as their justification for action. Now, having spent 40 years in the State Department, I'm going to talk a little bit differently, because in the past, I was one of those ones where after the political officers reached their agreement, they said to the econ guys, okay, go figure out some way to make peace here. Go figure out some ways to get investment. Go figure out some ways to increase the well-being. And let's be blunt. We've lost USAID. We've lost the Institute for Peace. We've lost a lot of the people who worked on this. But at the same time, I want to give maybe a bit of reassurance here, is there are a lot of people in Washington and elsewhere in the United States who are looking at what needs to be done and how we can rebuild, how we can recapture, how we might redesign some of these institutions. But the world is not going to wait for the United States to get its act together. I'm sorry, I'm being very blunt. So we are looking right now at a number of crises around the world. And I want to sort of look in a way at two different ones right now. And this comes to the sort of the original charge from Zlatko, Ukraine and the Middle East. Now, the interesting thing about Ukraine, I think probably you know, and Katya and Victor, God knows now, is that a lot of the Ukrainian economy is working very well. Ukraine has transformed its defense industry. Ukraine has sort of kept things going. yes, their refineries have all been smashed, but they've done other things, inventiveness. And there has been a drive in Washington, up until recently, but certainly by the Ukrainian embassy still, to talk about the investment opportunities in Ukraine. No, you might not be able to do something in Luhansk, but they're a big country, other places that could be doing things. And to sort of mobilize this, to mobilize American investment and mobilize American financing, to become engaged in helping Ukrainians keep their economy going, keep them growing, keep the innovation going, and giving them a chance to fight Russia. And I would argue, again, not as a Paul Mill guy, but Ukrainian inventiveness has been a tremendous battlefield advantage. Ukraine, coming to the Middle East. And I'm not going to talk about Gaza, I'm going to talk about Syria. And an interesting thing right now is, and I don't know how to extent if this is really being discussed, is that Ambassador Barak in Turkey, who is this U.S. envoy to Syria and Lebanon, one of the things he's really trying to do is sort of help reignite, remotivate, open up again the Syrian economy. And in doing that, one of the ideas I've heard is that he wants to do this, but he doesn't want China involved. So how is this going to happen? And he's also not necessarily using different things. So I want to sort of take a page out of what Dr. Guzenbauer did, talking about the security situation and steps that could be taken to improve security in Europe, and that it's going to take time, but there's steps that can be taken. And I want to try to turn this over to the econ side. And there's a way going here. And what I want to talk about here maybe is label this as utilizing a multi-track approach. Not necessarily multilateral, but multi-track. And some ways I would put forward that this might be done is, first of all, use the multilateral institutions. Now, the United States might not be terribly high on the United Nations this week. But the United Nations brings tremendous technical capability. It brings tremendous convening power. There's a lot of brain power and expertise there. Use that in the specialized agencies, even if you're mad at the Security Council. Two is, in the multilateral thing, are the FEs and the regional development banks. Using them, using their expertise, their capital, mobilizing that, mobilizing their convening authority to move things forward. Now, another thought in this multi-track approach that I would argue in Washington is direct state engagement. Okay, let's take this again as a thought experiment. The United States wants to see increased investment in Syria, and you're scared of the Chinese coming in with Belt and Road and other such things. You want to keep the Chinese out. All right, organize a conference. Organize different groupings. Bring in the Arabs. Find other ways to do this. And so essentially developing coalitions of the willing, of who sort of see an issue, a desire to help here, and can bring Arab capital, their expertise, opening up their markets as ways to sort of help Syria re-enter the world economically. Another point I would argue here is the need to have input from the host country. And this was something that was discussed last night. We've all seen, sort of the questions about the Washington Consensus and other things. The IMF tells you what to do, and you sit there and you scribe the paper, and you're unhappy. No. Outsiders are going to have ideas, but they're not going to be able to really do this. You all know this, but it's something that, frankly, does not get down into the systems. And we have to make that an explicit part of the system of rebuilding and use that. And then, finally, I would argue, again, no surprise here, getting in the private sector. Okay, private sector isn't just foreign. In rebuilding the countries, we have to find ways to mobilize and keep the capital that is inside that country, both human capital and financial capital. It sounds like a dumb idea. It says, oh God, this is brilliant. Who would have thunk this before? But we don't do it. And that's something we need to do. Second thing is to bring in that foreign capital. And that, of course, is going to require things such as getting the rule of law back in place, getting a sense of assurance, being able It's the problem we have right now in the U.S. We get these great numbers. We want $100 billion here and $250 billion there. What about the feasibility studies? Where are the sort of the shovel-ready projects? What can I get through a bank? And sort of bring these people together. So we need that realization. And I would like to, again, I hope this is a help, but again, thinking about how we can really address the poverty piece in building peace in terms of building sustainable peace in different countries. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I just want to tell you that we took 10 minutes from the next panel, which is okay, having in mind that there's 8 distinguished speakers compared to 6 distinguished speakers. And of course, Amr Musa's suggestion, I think this is a good idea that we today in a meeting that we have in preparation for Global Baku Forum at 3 o'clock, that we discuss that. Roshan said yesterday, basically speaking, the things that you are, since we are having discussions about Middle East, where never any one of us and our Israeli friends who were participating in Baku Forum never questioned two-state solution. Of course, but we can discuss about it at 3 o'clock in our meeting in preparation for Global Baku Forum. And Roshan, I suggest you for next time that we organize this automatic pilot that says when someone is finishing, if President of General Assembly, I know Chaba has a lot of experience. Last year I was witnessing how President Lula was simply shut off, and he was speaking in Brazilian TV just like this, saying nothing. Yesterday, 2 days ago, we saw how President Macron saying, I have nothing to do with it, when Erdogan was shut down, and Erdogan was speaking again with no voice anywhere. So maybe that's not a bad idea. No one blames Erdogan, no one blames Phil Young, no one blames Macron for shutting down and closing the speaker. So next time we'll do Roshan with artificial intelligence, so whoever moderates has a privilege that it's not me, it's technology. Thank you so much, and we are calling for next session.